The roar of the engines filled the air, a deep, threatening growl that echoed over the fields of southern England. It was 1940, and the skies above Britain were no longer just a canvas of clouds, they were a battlefield. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe's deadly formations were slicing through the morning mist, seeking to crush everything in their path. But among the ragged formations of British aircraft, one fighter stood out not for its power, not for its speed, but for something far stranger, a simple, almost laughable piece of tape on its wing. The Hawker Hurricane, a fighter that many had dismissed as old-fashioned and slow, had suddenly begun to perform feats no one expected. Pilots reported bullets bouncing harmlessly off their wings, rounds that should have torn the aircraft apart somehow failing to find their mark. Enemy gunners scratched their heads, convinced their aim had betrayed them. But the secret behind this improbable survival wasn't some miracle or hidden weapon. It was ingenuity raw, audacious, and yes, at first glance, utterly ridiculous. In a small, cluttered workshop not far from the airfield, one engineer had been tinkering with the Hurricane, drawing sketches in the margins of worn notebooks, testing angles, and experimenting with materials that seemed absurd at first. While generals debated strategy and politicians argued over policies, this engineer was quietly challenging the laws of aerodynamics, looking for a way to tilt fate in the favor of his pilots. It all started with a question that seemed laughable. Could a few strips of tape change the way a fighter plane behaved in combat? Most would have laughed outright. Tape? On a wing? You must be joking, colleagues said. But he persisted, driven by a belief that even the smallest tweak could mean the difference between life and death. In a war where every second mattered and every shot could be fatal, the margins were razor-thin. The Hurricanes themselves were sturdy, dependable machines, the workhorses of the RAF. They weren't as glamorous as the Spitfires, often overshadowed in the public imagination, but they were reliable and forgiving in the hands of a skilled pilot. Yet the engineer saw something more, a hidden potential waiting to be unlocked, a way to make the planes dance with the bullets that sought to destroy them. Late into the night, under dim lamps and the faint hum of distant aircraft engines, he would experiment. Tiny shifts in the wing's surface, subtle adjustments to the airflow, patterns that seemed random at first but were, in fact, carefully calculated. It was meticulous work, almost obsessive, and yet tinged with a certain humour, because to an outsider it looked like someone doodling with tape. But this was no mere doodle. Every centimetre of tape placed on that wing had a purpose, a precise calculation derived from countless hours of observation and trial. Meanwhile, the pilots of the Hurricanes were unaware that this quiet revolution was unfolding. They went about their training, their routines, flying into the same skies that had become death traps for so many before them. And yet, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, reports began to trickle back. Pilots who had returned from missions that should have been their last spoke of bullets missing them by inches, of enemy fighters unable to get a solid shot. The effect was subtle but undeniable. Planes that should have been easy prey were suddenly surviving against odds that seemed impossible. The tape itself was simple, nothing more than a few strips of adhesive material, carefully positioned along the leading edge of the wing. But in the right place, under the right conditions, it created a ripple in the air, a shift in airflow that caused incoming rounds to behave unpredictably. Some pilots described it as if the bullets were dodging the wing, a phenomenon no one fully understood at first. Scientists later tried to explain it, invoking physics, fluid dynamics, and aerodynamics. But the beauty of it lay in its simplicity. Sometimes, the most powerful solutions are also the simplest. Of course, not everyone believed the rumours. Some commanders dismissed the reports as pilot exaggeration, the kind of bravado that often fills wartime stories. But as more Hurricanes returned, with holes in unexpected places, or not at all, the pattern became undeniable. This wasn't luck, it wasn't coincidence, and it certainly wasn't magic. It was the result of one engineer's stubborn determination to challenge assumptions and find a way to bend the sky to his will. And so the stage was set. The war continued to rage above the English countryside, but a quiet, almost invisible force was beginning to tilt the scales. The Hurricanes, once considered modest workhorses, were now demonstrating a survival skill no one had predicted. The enemy would soon realize, too late, that this small, ridiculous innovation had given Britain's pilots an edge that bullets alone could not overcome. But before we get to the astonishing battles, the close calls, and the miraculous escapes, we need to understand the man behind the tape and the exact moment when his curious experiment crossed the line from eccentricity to life-saving brilliance. It began with a challenge, one that could have ended in ridicule or failure. The RAF was desperate, the Luftwaffe relentless, and every pilot lost was a story of heartbreak for families back home. In this pressure cooker of fear and urgency, the engineer's obsession with airflow and tape wasn't just a quirk, it was a spark of genius that would soon rewrite what was possible in aerial combat. By the time the first Hurricane, fitted with this improbable innovation, took to the skies over France, the stage was set for a series of events that would leave both friend and foe bewildered. Enemy gunners, trained to predict the paths of aircraft, found themselves miscalculating time and again. Pilots who had been resigned to death found themselves returning safely, their planes scarred but intact. And all of it traced back to a single seemingly absurd idea, a strip of tape placed with care and precision on a fighter's wing. It was a story that began quietly, almost unnoticeably, in a workshop full of sketches, scraps of metal, and the persistent hum of ingenuity. But soon, it would become legend, a tale of courage, creativity, and the quiet heroism of one engineer who refused to accept the limits others had imposed. And that is where our story begins, high above the smoke and chaos of war, where a ridiculous piece of tape would challenge the deadly logic of the battlefield and show the world that sometimes the smallest innovation can change the course of history. The sun had barely risen over the English countryside when the Hurricanes began to climb into the sky, engines screaming, wings slicing through the thin morning mist. For the pilots, every mission was a gamble. Enemy fighters patrolled the skies with deadly precision, and anti-aircraft fire carved deadly patterns below. Yet there was something different about these hurricanes, something that gave the men inside a quiet confidence they hadn't dared to feel before. The first reports came slowly, almost casually. A pilot returning from a patrol over northern France mentioned that bullets had zipped past his cockpit as if drawn away by invisible forces. Another described how enemy tracers seemed to curve unnaturally around his wing. The squadron laughed it off at first. "You must have been imagining things," one pilot joked. But the pattern repeated, mission after mission, and laughter turned into curiosity, then awe. The engineer watched the reports with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. This was exactly what he had hoped for, but he also knew how fragile the results could be. A slight misplacement of tape, a change in speed, or a gust of wind could render the effect useless. Yet somehow, these hurricanes were consistently surviving encounters that should have been fatal. It wasn't long before stories of near-miraculous escapes began circulating. One hurricane, diving to evade a Messerschmitt Bf 109, was riddled with bullets along the fuselage, but the wings remained untouched. The pilot later insisted that he could feel the plane twisting almost of its own accord, the air somehow shielding him from harm. In another instance, a formation of hurricanes returned from a bombing run, each reporting that tracer fire had seemed to dodge their wings like water flowing around a stone. For the enemy, it must have looked like sheer luck, or perhaps an unnatural talent possessed by British pilots. But the truth lay in science, in a precise understanding of aerodynamics that most people dismissed as trivial. The strips of tape, seemingly insignificant, disrupted the airflow in just the right way. Small pockets of turbulence formed along the leading edge of the wing, subtly altering the angle at which bullets struck. The rounds that should have embedded themselves in metal instead glanced off or ricocheted unpredictably. It was a delicate balance, a dance of physics and engineering that gave pilots a fraction of a second more to maneuver, more than enough time to avoid certain death. The engineer's methods were meticulous. He had experimented with the width, length, and placement of each strip of tape, testing each iteration under simulated conditions. Every adjustment was carefully documented, measured, and refined. It was a process of trial and error, patience, and obsession, but one fueled by a singular goal, to make the hurricane survive against odds that seemed impossible. The pilots, oblivious to the full extent of the experiment, began to notice that the planes behaved differently in combat. Turns were sharper, dives more controlled, and bullets that once would have torn through wings now seemed to glance harmlessly away. Confidence grew, and with confidence came audacity. British pilots started to engage the enemy in maneuvers they had previously avoided, pushing the Hurricanes to their limits. It was as if the plane itself had learned a new trick, guided by invisible hands. Word of these miraculous survivals eventually reached command, though they initially met it with skepticism. After all, it sounded absurd, one engineer, a few strips of tape, and suddenly the Hurricanes were dodging bullets in a way that defied expectation. Some dismissed it as pilot exaggeration, others worried that it was luck and couldn't last. But the evidence was mounting. After every sortie, the same reports emerged. Planes surviving encounters that should have been fatal, pilots returning from missions against overwhelming odds, and enemy fighters baffled by what seemed like uncanny evasion. Even the Luftwaffe began to take notice. German pilots reported a growing frustration when their shots missed or ricocheted. Their training emphasized precision, yet against these Hurricanes, bullets behaved unpredictably, ricocheting in ways that seemed to defy reason. Some believed they had encountered a new type of maneuver, perhaps an experimental tactic or hidden weapon. The reality was far simpler, and yet far more astonishing. A few strips of tape on the wings of a humble fighter plane. This innovation wasn't just about survival, it changed the psychology of combat. Pilots who once feared entering dogfights now approached engagements with a renewed sense of courage. The Hurricanes, previously considered workhorses, began to inspire confidence in the squadron. Commanders noticed that missions were being completed with higher success rates and fewer casualties. It was as if the tape had not only altered the behavior of bullets, but had transformed the mindset of the men flying the planes. One famous engagement highlighted the effectiveness of the modification. A squadron of Hurricanes found themselves ambushed by a larger formation of Messerschmitts. Enemy fire poured in, tracer rounds streaking across the sky like fiery snakes. Bullets tore through fuselages, engines, and tails. Yet the wings of the tape-fitted Hurricanes seemed untouched. The pilots weaved and twisted, exploiting every fraction of a second the modification afforded them. When the smoke cleared, the Hurricanes had survived what should have been a devastating defeat. The Luftwaffe pilots, frustrated and confused, could only retreat and report back a bewildering account of enemy planes that seemed to move as if bullets couldn't touch them. Historians later examined these encounters and realized the scale of the engineers' achievement. What appeared to be a laughable, almost childish idea, a few strips of adhesive tape had actually redefined the limits of what was possible in air combat. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't glamorous, but it was effective, elegant, and life-saving. In a war where every advantage mattered, it proved that even the smallest innovation could tip the balance. Beyond the physics, there were human stories woven into this tale. Pilots who should have been lost returned to their squadrons, their gratitude unspoken but palpable. Families waiting anxiously on the home front unknowingly benefited from one man's obsession in a quiet workshop. The tape was more than a modification, it was a lifeline, a small shield against the chaos of war. And yet, despite its success, the story remained largely unsung for decades. The engineer himself never sought fame. He continued to work in the shadows, tweaking designs, improving aircraft, always searching for the next small change that might save a life. While generals celebrated strategic victories, and historians recounted famous dogfights, the humble strip of tape and the man behind it quietly changed the way the Hurricane would be remembered not just as a plane, but as a symbol of ingenuity, courage, and survival. As the war raged on, the effect of the tape became part of legend. Enemy gunners approached with caution, pilots approached with confidence, and the Hurricane, once overshadowed by flashier fighters, proved that even the unassuming could become extraordinary with the right spark of innovation. The skies above Europe became the proving ground for this small but revolutionary idea, and its effects would ripple through countless missions, countless lives, and countless histories yet to be written. The sky over northern France was a canvas of smoke, tracer, fire, and chaos. Hurricanes, sleek and defiant, cut through the haze, their engines screaming, wings flexing under the stress of high-speed maneuvers. Pilots gripped their controls with white-knuckled intensity, each heartbeat matching the pulse of their aircraft. Enemy fighters swarmed like shadows, but something extraordinary was at play. The Hurricanes were surviving in ways no one thought possible. It was during one particularly brutal mission that the tape's full potential revealed itself. A squadron of Hurricanes was escorting bombers when they were intercepted by a large formation of Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds. The German planes dove from above, guns blazing, and for a moment it seemed certain that the Hurricanes would be torn apart in minutes. Pilots shouted over the radio, weaving desperately, yet the bullets that should have shredded their wings glanced off, ricocheted, or simply missed. One pilot later described it as if the plane itself had a sixth sense. It felt like the air was pushing the bullets away, he said. Another recalled seeing tracers curve in impossible arcs, narrowly missing the leading edges of his wings. The effect wasn't magic, but it felt that way to the men in the cockpit. Their lives depended on split-second decisions, and the tape had given them the tiniest margin that made all the difference between survival and death. The Luftwaffe pilots, trained to deadly precision, were bewildered. Their formations were disrupted, their aim repeatedly foiled by forces they could neither understand nor anticipate. The Hurricanes dodged, turned, and climbed with a confidence that seemed almost supernatural. Reports from that day would later describe it as one of the most inexplicable engagements of the Battle of Britain, with German pilots swearing they had been targeted by a mysterious new British technology, or perhaps by sheer luck. Meanwhile, back at the airfields, engineers and commanders were analysing the reports. The patterns were undeniable. A small strip of tape, carefully applied to the leading edge of the wing, had changed the physics of air combat in subtle but profound ways. Enemy fire behaved unpredictably, giving pilots an almost impossible edge. But it wasn't just about bullets, it was about confidence, tactics, and survival. Pilots who had once hesitated to engage now pressed attacks with daring maneuvers, knowing their aircraft could endure threats that once would have been fatal. The legend of the tape grew, whispered among squadrons and passed along in letters and debriefings. Pilots began to see it not just as a trick or a modification, but as a talisman, a symbol of ingenuity that could turn the tide in the direst situations. Stories circulated of Hurricanes returning with fuselages riddled with enemy fire, wings scarred but intact, and men who should have been lost alive and unharmed. Each story carried a sense of awe, disbelief, and gratitude, for they knew that survival was no longer left to chance alone. The engineer who had devised this ridiculous solution never sought recognition. He continued to work quietly, making small adjustments, experimenting with new patterns, and improving the designs. Yet the impact of his work was undeniable. Lives were saved, missions were completed, and the Hurricane, once overshadowed by faster, flashier fighters, had proven its worth in the most extraordinary fashion. It wasn't a technological marvel in the traditional sense, but a testament to creativity, observation, and the power of thinking differently. By the end of the war, the legacy of the wing tape had been cemented. Pilots spoke of it in reverent tones, historians noted its curious role in combat reports, and engineers studied its effect with fascination. It was a reminder that innovation doesn't always come in grand gestures or expensive prototypes. Sometimes, the most impactful discoveries are the simplest, almost laughable ideas, applied with precision, thought, and daring. And yet, the story of the tape was more than just an engineering triumph. It was about the human spirit, the refusal to accept limits, the courage to experiment, and the willingness to find hope in small, seemingly insignificant solutions. For every pilot who returned home safely, every squadron that completed a mission against overwhelming odds, the tape symbolized something greater: resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet heroism of those who work behind the scenes to make life possible for others. In the end, the Hurricanes continued to soar over Europe, their engines roaring and wings flexing under the strain of battle. Enemy fighters learned to respect them, pilots learned to trust them, and the small strips of tape, humble and unassuming, became a secret weapon in the most intense skies of the Second World War. The engineers' work had saved lives, altered tactics, and created a legacy that would endure far beyond the battlefields. It is a story of imagination meeting necessity, of a man daring to challenge assumptions, and of the extraordinary effects of a single, ridiculous idea. A strip of tape, carefully placed, changed the fate of countless men, proving that even in the most brutal, unforgiving theatres of war, human ingenuity can find a way to tilt the scales, to give hope when it seems impossible, and to let the hurricanes once considered ordinary dodge bullets no one expected. The war raged on, as it always does. But above the clouds, in the roar of engines and the glint of sunlight off metal wings, one truth remained clear. Sometimes, survival doesn't come from strength, speed, or firepower. It comes from daring to think differently, to experiment when others laugh, and to believe that even the smallest innovation can make a life or death difference. And that is how one engineer's ridiculous wing tape changed the skies forever.